What's up, guys? So we're just going to take a minute to kind of try to wrap this the things we talked about for the first couple, first 5 weeks or so in a little bow here. When it comes to camera angles and cutting, we just see if we can't draw some conclusions from this. So basically, when it comes down to filmmaking, you're basically just set with a series of choices that ultimately begin with your script. Now, we didn't talk much about script writing this week, but we have talked about it in the past. And I just wanted to make sure that we're aware that if you're going to shoot a film, I think I always said that the planning process might be the most important, because in the planning process you can get a good idea of your limitations, you can get a good idea of what you want to do, and you can get a good idea of how you're going to go about filming it. And then if you have a plan to begin with, then all the shooting stuff goes forward. So generally, when you write your script, obviously you want to understand what's going on in the script, what's it about, right? And then after you kind of figure out what's going on in the plot, you can kind of figure out character motivations. Generally speaking, I tend to think now my favorite films tend to have a good plot. There are a few films out there that don't really have a plot to them. I think the one that pops to mind the most often is Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump, the movie, doesn't necessarily have there's not a goal that he's looking for like the entire movie. He's mostly just talking about little vignettes of his life, and they kind of have only tangential connection just in terms of the main character, but there's no real plot for the whole thing. He's just sort of sitting there, and then he's on a bench, and then he meets his girlfriend, and then that's that, right? But as far as character motivations go, that's a good obviously thing. We want to make sure we know who our characters are and why they're doing the things they're doing. And if they're an active character, an active protagonist that's working towards a goal, that goal is best presented in terms of the plot. If their motivations are direct, a result of what's happening in the film, then that's great. Theme is great. Theme is wonderful, and there's some great movies that operate under trying to quote unquote say something about things. But honestly, if you're really heavy on theme and you don't have a whole lot of plot or character motivations, then I think your theme kind of gets lost in terms of people asking questions as to why things are happening on screen. So I think in terms of just a hierarchy, I think your plot is probably the most important. If your plot makes sense, and if there's an interesting goal to take care of and people understand what's going on. If we don't quite know why the characters are doing what they're doing, I mean, that's, okay, so this can be kind of papered on, right? So character is, X, and he's doing Y because of Z, right? So long as we can understand what he's doing, if the motivations aren't 100% clear, at the very least they can be sort of put on something, like for instance, okay, well, he's a cop, right? Okay, all right, so by virtue of him being a cop, right, he just wants to stop the bad guy, right? That's the plot, stop the bad guy, and we understand his motivations because of who he is, right? So it's pretty simple too. So I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on this, but just when we start off everything, obviously we have a series of questions to ask, a series of decisions to make, choices to make. So those choices and those questions continue on when we start shooting. Now, we talked about the two most important questions when it comes to moving your camera, and that's the what's the best viewpoint to capture, and then what's the best area, like image size, right? So do we want to get close, or do we get far away, right? Obviously, if we want to see something in detail, then we want to get close. If we want to see, where things are in terms of the geography around, we want to get far away. We want to understand where people are located. Then we want to, have a big enough, small enough image to everyone can fit in. If we want to focus in on emotions, we want to get close. All that stuff. Those are all very important questions, right? Understanding what should be shown on screen is paramount for allowing the audience to understand, what is going on, right? So if we need them to see something, we want to make sure that we have the power to show them that. The other thing we want to keep in mind is audience interest. So if, for instance, we cut to something and we hold on something, is the audience going to lose interest? Are they going to become sort of impassive about it? I would say, obviously the big thing there is when we cut in close, when we get far away, which is going to be the most interesting thing to look at, and then the last little thing when it comes to shooting and choosing your camera angles is we don't necessarily want to become predictable when it comes to the pattern that we're establishing, but at the same time, we don't want to confuse the audience. And this is a bit of a balancing act, because if, for instance, you have, 5 like scenes, and every scene begins the same way: wide shot, medium shot, close up, 1 2 3, 1 2 3, then it becomes a bit predictable, and it becomes a little tedious to get through. It's like, well, here's the wide shot, here's the, back and forth, right? So you think to yourself, okay, well, maybe instead of opening the next scene on a wide shot, maybe we can open up the next scene on a close up. And so we can do our little match cut there, where we start in close on like a bottle, and we cut to another bottle in another location, and we're there, right? Well, the idea there is simply that we don't necessarily need to have a very, we want to make sure there's a pattern developed so the audiences get confused, because if like we start like showing things that don't make sense, then that's bad. We want the audience to focus on screen, but at the same time, we don't want it to become a sort of a by the numbers predictable kind of a pattern that the audience starts to get bored with. So we want to keep their interest by virtue of visual variety. That's where visual variety comes in. But we definitely don't want to confuse our viewers. So we want to make sure we have a good balancing act, right? So when it comes to that, so when you shoot and you choose your camera angles, obviously you want to keep the viewpoint and the area questions in mind. We also want to make sure we keep audience interest in mind, making our shots look, dynamic and interesting. Is the action on screen being complemented by your camera angles, and then finally we want to make sure that we're not being too predictable about how we shoot each scene, like the same series of shots. But at the same time, we also don't want to confuse the audience by showing them things that don't make sense, right? All right, and then when you are obviously shooting in class, we want to make sure that we're keeping our limitations in mind. We only have so much time each class period to shoot. Not even 50 minutes. So we come in, we have 50 minutes once the bell rings, but obviously we have to have time to gather our wits and talk with our teammates about our plan. We have to take attendance. We have to do all manner of things. I have to tell you guys what the plan is for the week. And then obviously we only have a limited number of locations. Now, even on campus, there's a few places we can't go, and there's a few places that there's only so many like empty classrooms with desks that we can use. So you got to keep those in mind. Now, when it comes to actors, I'm not trying to say any of you guys are bad actors, but what I'm trying to say is you guys aren't professional actors, and so there's a limitation when it comes to how well you can memorize your lines, because that's a thing that you get trained to do. You learn techniques to memorize your lines faster, and you get memorize techniques being able to deliver long lines better and stuff. So you think to yourself, okay, well, I want to make sure that I'm able to break this up into multiple shots. So I'm going to have this, not be one long sentence, but a series of sentences that they can have just spit out one sentence, and then we cut, and another sentence, and we cut back and forth, between like medium shots or wide shots, progressively getting closer, changing angles, all those different things. The idea is you want to keep your actors in mind. And then as far as equipment goes, we only have so many wireless microphones, so we want to make sure that when we're shooting, we might not be able to shoot the whole thing in a wide shot, because we might not be able to hear everybody, because we, again, not professional actors, so people might be talking quieter. There might be like a loud buzzing light there, or echoes in the hallway, things like that. The idea is that you want to keep these things in mind. So people talk about the Russian winter, defeating Napoleon and defeating the Nazi army when they invaded Russia. Well, obviously there's winter every year. And so they have to account for, if you're going to invade Russia, you got to account for the winter, right? So don't invade during the wintertime. So same thing kind of goes here. You can't say, well, I would have, this would have been better, but we're here at school. We didn't have much time. You know how much time you've got. You know how much time you've got to shoot. And so that's why I always say, again, planning is a good use of your time, is making sure you have a good plan going into it. So, keeping all this stuff in mind, sorry, when it comes to your shooting, that's a big part. So again, choosing your camera angles based on our limitations, based on our time constraints, based on what we've got in terms of our actors and stuff. That all that stuff is an important series of questions to be asking when you're deciding on your camera angles, and you decide on your camera angles as you're writing your script and as you're planning everything out. As far as editing, you want to keep editing in mind when you're shooting, and a big part of that is the technical elements, and that kind of comes back to sound. That kind of also comes back to light and stuff. I always talked about we don't want to film in a place where like we're in front of a brightly lit window and we can't see the faces of our actors. We can't see the faces of our actors. We can't focus in on them, right? And if it goes from like them being well lit to them being poorly lit, that's going to be a big thing that you got to keep in mind. Now, so far I don't think I've taken off too many points for one shot being more shadowy than the other, and you've got your automatic settings on your cameras, so it's pretty easy to kind of like keep that all consistent. But there's things like coloration. Say for instance, if you're in a area that's a little more yellow because of the yellow walls, it looks very yellow. You go outside, it looks very green because there's a lot of green and stuff like that. Those things obviously you want to keep those in mind. But if for instance like mid shot things suddenly look red because of whatever reason, that's a technical kind of flaw, you want to avoid those. So you want to keep editing in mind when you're shooting, sound, picture quality, things like that. As far as aesthetic elements, right? Aesthetics is basically mean that they're pleasing to the eye, right? So in this case, focus, things like that, right? But beyond that, again, is the person like cut off in the frame? That could also be considered a technical element. Is the person, is what we're looking at, is it crooked? Is it this? Is it that? Basically the idea is that it shouldn't be confusing to the audience. It should be easy to follow. And then finally, as far as narrative factors go, you want to make sure that continuity is not being broken in terms of all the different shots you have, and that again you're able to cut these things in a way that it's easy to follow what's going on, that the story makes sense, that you're suggesting a progression of events. So again, you keep editing in mind when shooting, and then when you are going to edit, just keep in mind what you can't do when you're editing. You can't change the character's screen direction. If a person is on the left looking right in the close-up, but they're on the right looking left in the wide shot, you can't flip that around. Now, if for instance, like both characters, were flipped around, then you could conceivably do that. But you got to think to yourself, like if you're in Locker Alley and you're in a place where like the lockers are behind one person, but they're not behind the other person. If suddenly you flip directions and now there are no lockers behind them in their close up, then suddenly we have there's a bit of an issue, right? So you want to keep in mind that you can't necessarily flip the characters over. You can, but it might not make sense. So you got to keep in mind, like, screen direction, the 180 degree rule. You can't change the tone of a shot. So for instance, if someone is laughing or smiling when they're supposed to be delivering a serious line, or if they're obviously you wanted to get in close, on this scene, you want to get in close to someone's face, and you have like you can't grow that inside the editor without it becoming all grainy and whatnot. So you gotta keep in mind like what you can't do. You can't necessarily change the way that a shot looks inside the editing bay without compromising the quality of your film. You can't necessarily, well, you can make things slow down. You can make things speed up. But if there's like talking going on and it's taking a minute to kind of get through, if for instance you followed someone as they were leaving and then now we have to wait, you can't speed it up because you're gonna notice that everything is speeded up. Especially if there's like movement in the background and stuff like that. All that stuff is important to keep in mind, that you can't really just digitally speed things up without it looking weird. If there's a jump cut and you're trying to cover up the jump cut, you can't cover it up with a fade. You can't dissolve within the shot to make it to cover up that jump cut without having a cover shot. That might be like a reaction shot, like a cutaway or an insert shot, something like that. So you got to keep in mind, like if you stop the camera and you have to start over like mid action, then you're gonna need to make sure you get those cover shots. And the same thing goes if there's a mistake. If like you say there's a mistake, like you walk in, you pick up a cup of coffee, but but somewhere in between you look up at the camera and then you keep going, right? That's gonna be a break in continuity, it's breaking the fourth wall and stuff like that. That's a mistake. That should be either a reshot, or if you have a cover shot, you can cut that stuff out of the middle, like say with the cut in close up. Or those other things. So you got to make sure that like you keep that in mind as well. You can't you can't remove footage from the middle of a shot unless you have a cover shot. So you keep that in mind when you're shooting as well. And then finally, you can't correct technical imperfections like bad sound or bad light without some severe, like you can brighten something up inside Premiere. That's true, but generally speaking, it's not going to look right. It's going to make everything it's going to put like a little like white sheen over everything. It might overexpose other areas, and there's only so much you can do with bad sound. Unless you're going to redub it over or something like that. So keep in mind what you can't do in editing that has to be done inside the camera here. And then finally, just keep in mind this: films basically, obviously you write the film, but when you shoot the film, that's like that's the building blocks of your editing. You assemble it inside your editing. So if you conceive it inside the camera and you assemble it in your editing program, the better your conception, the better your assembled film. So keep all that in mind. So that's just general conclusions. This week we're going to be talking about close-ups. It's going to be a short sort of a series of lectures because close-ups is a pretty short chapter. So we're just going to go through that this week, and then we'll come back to continuity and composition the following week. All right, very cool. See you guys around. Happy learning.